Good evening, distinguished guests. Before we start, I would like to invite our Indigenous student, Nicholas Howie, to conduct Welcome to Country.
Orami, Pujuri na Junila Yagu. Hello, it is good I see you all today. My name is Nicholas Howie. I am a proud Darug man from the Bulbarongal clan, which sits in the Richmond Basin area. I'm also actually a graduated student here at Western Sydney University as of this year. I just finished my physics. Oh, thank you. I just finished my physics degree, and next year I commence my Masters of Teaching. I'm quite excited. This year, I have been lucky enough to start learning my own mother tongue, a language that was almost completely silenced by colonists. And today, it is my honor to learn and speak our words out loud with respect to my old people who were shamed and prohibited from speaking in their language. Their elders and ancestors had shared for many, many generations. Ngini, Ngaya, Ngalawa, Darug Ngurua. You and I sit on Darug country. Well, I guess I'm standing, but you get my point. This is my country. And by learning my language this year, I have learned a great many things. Perhaps one of the most surprising is that in the culture of this country, we do not say thank you. In fact, we don't even have a word for it. The closest we have, didgerigor, means I've had my share, that's enough for me. The reason is simple, and I think actually quite beautiful. Sharing and looking after each other is such a fundamental part of this culture that thank you is so heavily implied within the cultural standard that saying it is just not required. There isn't a thankless action or job because the thank you is always there, even if it's unspoken. The thank you is still there, but in a way that is hard to comprehend in our world today, especially where praise is expected for even the mildest of actions. But my role today is to welcome you to country. The language here is a little tricky too. I am not welcoming you into a space that I own. This isn't my country. In Darug culture, ownership doesn't exist. Instead, think of it as me sharing my language with you. I don't own the language, nor does my language own me, but it is a gateway to how I think and feel. To welcome you is to share a piece of myself. Likewise, when someone shares something with me, I see it as an act of trust and of caring. To welcome you to Ngura, to country, I am telling you that I trust you to respect this land and its culture and invite you to share yourself with country. Knowing this, it will probably not surprise you to learn that ngara, our word for listen, is a very important word. To ngara, to listen, is to understand when someone shares a story, some food, or some knowledge with you, that they are also sharing a part of themselves, their ingami, their spirit. To listen in this deeper way is to understand this sharing, to take in what they give, to process it, and to respond. Sometimes you respond with words, and sometimes with thoughts, sometimes with feelings. But deep listening can be a difficult thing to achieve. It takes practice and it takes patience. And that is exactly what we are here to do tonight. This symposium is for us to ngara, to listen, and to baila, to speak. This is our chance to share the knowledge and cultures that we bring with us. This is a chance to learn from each other, and I think it is beautiful that it is happening here on Darug country. Before I say the final welcome, I would like to mention that it is no accident that Ngalawa, Ngara, and Ngura all sound so similar. We sit, we listen on country. But to close, I would ask you one thing. Yanama Bajari Gumura. Walk with good spirit. Yanama Bajari Darug Murua. Walk well on Darug country. And Warami, Welcome.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for this beautiful, beautiful and very touching welcome. It's unbelievable, and you are graduating. Last time we met, I think you were in year 2, university year 2. Congratulations. And your welcome is specifically significant and meaningful, enlightening to our international guests. So thank you so much. I also like to pay my respect to Indigenous elders past and present. Welcome to the joint reception of 10th Australian-China Transcultural Studies Symposium and 9th Foundation for Australian Studies in China Conference, organized by the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture, RAC, at Western Sydney University, and the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC, in partnership with Beijing Foreign Studies University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of RAC and your MC tonight. Over 30 years ago, I came from Beijing Foreign Studies University as an international student. Sponsored by the then Australian China Council to pursue my PhD studies in English and Australian literatures at the University of Sydney, under the supervision of a Professor Dame Leonie Kramer. Jump to 2017 and 2022, the Department of Foreign Affairs, DFAT, compiled and published 45 years, 45 stories, and 50 Australian China stories in celebration of the 45 years and 50 years of the diplomatic relations between Australia and China. I had an honor of being included in both books. For contributions to people engagement that underpins our official diplomatic relationship. Luckily, back then, there were no caps on international students. Tonight, we are thrilled to have so many distinguished guests. I will leave to Professor Barney Glover to acknowledge those guests in his opening speech. Let me first say a few words about the role of the Institute for Australian Chinese Arts and Culture, RAC, at Western Sydney University. RAC is located in one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse centers of Australia. Australia is home to more than 1 million people of Chinese descent, with a wide range of identities, life stories, views, and places of origin. We believe arts and culture are essential to the interconnection, to the cohesion and vitality of our culturally and linguistically diverse communities. This institute has positioned itself as a hub to promote and enhance arts and culture exchanges between Australia and mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the wider Sino-Sophia. RAC has also played an important role locally in contributing to and being connected with a vibrant multicultural and multilingual society through our distinctive and inclusive arts and culture programs. Now, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, who doesn't really need an introduction. Professor Barney Glover, a distinguished higher education sector leader and an accomplished mathematician, has been, until very recently, the Vice Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University. Now is the Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia. Under his more than a decade of outstanding leadership at Western Sydney University, the university has grown its reputation in research impact and student success in Australia and internationally, which has been demonstrated by Western Sydney University having been named world #1 again for its social, environmental, and economic impact in the 2024 Times Higher Education University Impact Rankings, 3rd time in a row, based on the achievements of the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, Professor Glover was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for his distinguished service to tertiary education, professional associations, and cultural organizations. A couple of weeks ago, Professor Glover was named Sydney Sider of the Year in recognition of his role in helping transform Western Sydney during his tenure as a Vice Chancellor of Western Sydney University. One of Professor Glover's great achievements and legacies is to have rapidly expanded Western Sydney University's international reputation and outlook, including among many advances in transnational education in Vietnam and Indonesia, and having established a range of partnerships and collaborations with universities in mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. A team of high achieving academics of Chinese background has been set up to engage and develop partnership most effectively with mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and several of us are here. And tonight's event is the very outcome of one of the many visits Professor Glover led as Vice Chancellor. This is last October at Beijing Foreign Studies University, meeting with the then president of Beijing Foreign Studies University, Professor Yang Dan, signed on the agreement of co-organizing this very conference. You may wonder where we went during our visits and what it was like traveling with Professor Glover. I've randomly picked a couple of photos to show you. We have been always most warmly welcomed by our partner universities. This is 2018 at Fuzhou University in Fujian province. The warm welcome is certainly reflected by the most gigantic welcoming screen. And this is at Fengjia University, Taiwan, where a staff member who received us happened to be a Western Sydney University graduate of translation interpreting. She just published his book of translation and was thrilled to give a copy to her Vice Chancellor. It was such a rewarding encounter. We also traveled with then Chancellor, our Chancellor, Professor Peter Shergott, now the chair of the new independent board of ARC. This is to our partner university, Jilin Agriculture University in Changchun, northwest of China. So we're all over the place. And this is East China Jiaotong University in Nanchang, Jiangxi province. The most impressive studio-style photo we've ever taken. We were visiting the University Museum and invited to take a photo in the Room of the Future. A pair of footprints was marked on the floor for the leader's central position. But the prints were too big to be covered by the real feet. I can assure you that Professor Glover was not a cardboard cutout. Witnessing Professor Glover's extraordinary abilities to connect and to win trust at discussion table has been our great learning experience. Traveling with him has also been very enjoyable. When we traveled as a group, Professor Glover never once abandoned us and went into the Qantas Chairman's Lounge. He always insisted sitting with us in a very ordinary airport cafe. Also, he was always the first one to be at the hotel lobby, waiting for us to come down, and happily traveled with us in a minivan to universities, conducting study sessions during our ride. Claiming he's the tallest, and he is, Professor Glover often pushed the trolley for us. There is a Chinese saying, 人走茶凉, literally saying, when one leaves, one's tea gets cold. Meaning, when you leave your position, people around you also leave you. That will never happen. Professor Glover, we will always keep your tea warm. Now, please welcome Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia, Emeritus Vice Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Professor Barney Glover, AO, to give the opening speech.
Thank you, Jing. That was lovely, and they're a great set of photographs. So thank you for doing that. I really do appreciate it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Barramatical people of the Darug Nation, to acknowledge their elders past and present on this unceded land of the Darug people. I want to acknowledge Nicholas Howie. Nicholas I've known since he seemed to be very young, but he is now a physics graduate, and we need more physicists in this country. As Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner, I can tell you that. And we certainly need more teachers, and we need more First Nations physicists and teachers. So Nick covers a lot of ground very rapidly. And I must admit, I agree with Jing. You're welcome to country whenever I've heard it. A young person, particularly in language, is incredibly moving and special. And I know that our international visitors here this evening will have appreciated, as Jing said, your words of welcome, and the explanation in the context of Darug language was very impressive. Nick, thank you so much. And when you do the masters, go on and do a PhD. Just keep going. We need you to keep going. There's no doubt about it. It's certainly a great pleasure to be back and to catch up with so many friends again. I've got to apologise for one thing in this speech. Jing helped with this speech, obviously, make sure I didn't miss anything, but also had the habit of using we and our when I talk about this university. Now, I no longer have the right to be quite as expressing my ownership of Western Sydney University as this speech will indicate, but it is very quick for me to jump back into that mode when I'm in One Parramatta Square here in Parramatta to talk about what we're doing as a university and the great achievements of our students and staff. So excuse me for that right at the outset. I'd also like to acknowledge, I know the new Vice-Chancellor can't be here, Distinguished Professor George Williams, but I've spoken to George on a number of occasions. I know how committed he is to the international partnerships that we're forging. A huge amount to do in the first, I think, 10 weeks he's been in the role. But I know that he will prioritise the relationship with China, and we look forward to that. We look forward to it. There you go, already in the future. So I do want to acknowledge George this evening. Now, there are a few acknowledgements and many people to acknowledge. When Jing was about to introduce the esteemed person for the speech, we all looked at Nick Jose because that is the appropriate person. It could have been anyone on this table, to be frank. So I do want to acknowledge so many special guests that are with us here this morning. I want to begin with Professor Jing Han, in particular, Director of IAC here at Western Sydney University, who's been such a powerhouse with Jocelyn. I know Jocelyn's here. I saw Jocelyn a little earlier, who's another one of our great esteemed guests, Professor Jocelyn Che, who I've enjoyed working with so much during my period as Vice-Chancellor. But I want to acknowledge Jing and, of course, for bringing forward the idea in 2023, only a year ago, to be here tonight to celebrate this jointly with FASIC. So it's great to have that opportunity. So thank you, Jing, for all you have done. I want to offer a warm welcome to all the participants and the presenters, particularly those who've travelled from China and from across Australia. Welcome to Western Sydney University. I want to acknowledge Dr. Angela Lehman, the chair of FASIC, which is the co-organiser of the event, Associate Professor Li Yu Wen from BFSU. Lovely to see you again, representing the president of BFSU. Please pass on my regards to the president. Great to see you again. Ms. Lin Shuo-Chin, the Consul for Education from the Chinese Consulate General in Sydney. Great to meet up with you again, and your colleague, Mao Yifang. Nick Jose, an outstanding contributor to IAC and to Western Sydney University for so many years now. If I was to say more about Nick, we'd be here for longer than my speech, which I won't do. Others will introduce Nick a little bit longer for his expertise in arts and cultural exchange between Australia and China. And he'll be giving our keynote. Kevin Hopgood-Brown, the former chair of FASIC, the current chair of our IAC Management Advisory Committee, great friend. Kevin, great to see you again. Helen Horsington, the Deputy Director of the National Foundation for Australia-Chinese Relations. It's great to have Helen with us. Professor James Lawrenson is here. I saw James a little earlier from the sister institution. We won't go into that history, but there is a sister institution, the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS. Great to have James here. We've been eating lobster together very recently at the Australia-China Business Chamber gala evening, which was to promote, obviously, Australian lobster to China. So there was literally a huge amount of lobster that night. And I could tell you more, but we haven't got time. It was great. To the extraordinary Emeritus Professor Colin McCarris from Griffith. Colin, great to see you again. To the conveners of the conference, David Walker, Greg McCarthy, Pukong Kee, welcome, great names associated with Australia-China relations. I think Michael D'Agostino is here, who is the director of the Chow Chuk Wing Museum, formerly at the Campbelltown Gallery. A number of WSU colleagues are in the room, so it's been great to catch up. I want to acknowledge Dr. Nicolene Murdoch, who is our PVC Global Partnerships, ours, apparently at JSA as well, Nicolene, but recently appointed, and I wanted to congratulate Nicolene. I appointed Nicolene originally, so it's a great success story for me that you're now Vice President, Pro Vice Chancellor for Global Partnerships. I'm very worthy in that regard. I mentioned Jocelyn, of course. Professor Jeff Lee is here, former local member, great minister in the New South Wales government. I know Jeff's here somewhere. I saw him a little earlier. Emeritus Professor Ivor Indyk, is Ivor here? Hopefully will come. Great to have Ivor with us. Distinguished Professor Anthony Ullman, Professor Ned Rossiter, many, many others. And as Jing said, one of the joys of travel in China, there are many joys of traveling in China, and I've had that privilege for so long. But one of the joys is the people you work with and have a chance to travel with. And there are a number of them here, and I'm glad there's a chance to acknowledge them. Our Associate Deans International for mainland China, for Hong Kong, for Taiwan, they've been an extraordinary initiative that Yichen Lan, Francis Yichen Lan, now the president of Furen Catholic University in Taiwan. And I know he's here with us in spirit because Yichen would be, without a doubt, here with us in spirit. Literally now, of course, because of a great connection to God, so he'll be here. He was great to travel with, as were our wonderful associate deans. And there are so many of them here. It's wonderful to acknowledge Jing He, and Jing He's here from education. June is here, June Wang. It's great to see June again. I was talking to June about the twins. It's wonderful to see June. Stella is here, School of Business. Stella, thank you. Great to see you. Zhonghua's here, of course, one of our great scientists, and maybe the only male in the group. No, there were a couple of males in the group. Julie Wen, I hope Julie is with us somewhere in the room. So welcome to all of you, along with Jing. We had a great time together in China. And if we'd had time to this evening, because I'm now eating into Nick's time, so I've got to stop, I would have spent time talking about the one thing I didn't do in China that I've always wanted to do, which is to attend one of Jing's lectures, because they're legendary and they're best done in China, not in Australia. They're great in Australia, but it's in China where you'll have 400 or 500 people in the room, young people who are all interested in interpreting and translation and in subtitling. And Jing has the most extraordinary presentation. I think I sat through 5 minutes of one once before I was dragged away. If you get a chance, travel to China just for that experience. And welcome to all of you. It's so great to have you here this evening. So I hope I haven't, there's a number of important people in the room, and if I've missed you, my apologies for that. It's Jing's fault. The Australia-China Transcultural Studies Symposium, or the China-Australia version, depending on where it's being held, was a joint initiative of BFSU and Adelaide Uni back, no, I can't say Adelaide University anymore, can I? Because that's the new university. It's the University of Adelaide, that's the current one. And it started back in 2013. The original inaugural organisers were Professor Sun Yuzong of EFSU, Nick Joseph, of course, of Adelaide, Greg McCarthy from UWA, all here with us tonight, so that's great. The previous 9 symposiums have been held in Beijing, Adelaide and Perth, with the 9th being held in Beijing last year, co-organised by Western Sydney University. In October last year, so it's only a year ago, literally, I led the delegation. You saw the photograph And we had Yi Chen with us now at Furen. We had Jing, Jocelyn, Jing He, Julie, and we attended the China-Australia Transcultural Studies Symposium held at BFSU. And I had an honour then of giving an overly long opening speech. So the tradition continues. During my subsequent meeting there, as you saw the photograph, with the president of BFSU, Professor Yang Dan, we reached an agreement on the 10th symposium being held here, organised by IAC. I'm so glad that's come to fruition here in this wonderful 1PSQ. Now, during my 10 years as VC at Western Sydney, one of the key achievements that have led WSU to be #1 in the world, which Jing alluded to, for its social, ecological and economic impact in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. And John Ross is here, one of the great journalists for the Times Higher Ed, so be careful what you say, because John will write a story about it tomorrow. But we were 3 times in a row. He can't really say anything negative about WSU because we've won the award 3 years in a row. And it's that success around internationalisation, though, that is at the core of our success. So John would write great stories in any case about the university, but internationalisation is really one of the key elements of what makes the UN SDGs so important to Western Sydney University and our outreach. And I think that campaign over a decade to build our international partnerships has helped with our success in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings. We have a lot of great partnerships. I know that Nicolene will now be working on them and continuing to work on them into the future. And I know you'll be looking forward to your first trip in this new role to China, across mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, right throughout Asia. Jing mentioned the fact we have a fabulous campus in Vietnam with now over 3,000 students, which is going very well. And we've just opened, I can't get out of the habit, we've just opened the campus in Indonesia. And I've seen photographs of it and it looks wonderful, looks extraordinary. And you'll see that in Surabaya and will develop over the next few years. And next beyond that is India. So it's a great expansion of the transnational footprint for Western Sydney University. And that's a very different university now to what it was a decade ago. Developing and establishing partnerships in student and academic exchange, joint collaborative research with universities in China in particular will continue to bring tremendous benefits to Australian higher education and to students and academics in both countries. I know we're going through a difficult time that Jing alluded to with the international student caps. I'm sure that we'll work our way through that as a nation in the context of the way I hope the federal government will move to a growth strategy for international education beyond this period of capping growth. But still within that, there is an enormous opportunity to build our relationships, particularly in China. So I'm sure that will continue to be pivotal and important to Australian universities. There's a lot of reform going on in tertiary education in Australia. I was privileged to be part of the university's Accord process as a panel member. For those from overseas, this is a review of tertiary education in Australia that was conducted last year. Mary O'Kane was the chair and I was on the panel that delivered a 400-page report to the Minister earlier this year. Many of the recommendations now being implemented, and I think that will give us a very solid base. We'll see more about what that means in terms of funding hopefully in the near future. But my new role at Jobs and Skills Australia very much intersects with the work of the Accord. This new role is about how do we ensure that we provide to the Australian government the recommendations needed to uplift all Australians to participate to their full potential in the Australian labour market. And to do that, we need to understand the jobs of the future, the labour market now and what's emerging in the future, what skills people will need to fully contribute in that labour market. And when you talk about skills, whether our education and training system is fit for purpose. Is it delivering the graduates and the vocational training outcomes that we need as a nation where we're going to see such growth over the next decade and beyond. So there is a very strong relationship between this role and the work of the Accord and the intersection. I'm looking forward to the overlay of the two into the future. Now, I'm particularly pleased to see the 10th Australia-China Transcultural Studies Symposium and the 9th FASIC conference are for the first time being held back-to-back, jointly organised by IAC and FASIC, and I'm sure that's going to lead to even greater collaboration. The 10th Australian-China Symposium focuses on all aspects of transcultural exchange between Australia and China in the past through to the present and onward looking into the future. There will be presentations on Australian literature studies, Chinese Australian writing, media studies, transnational studies, comparative and translation studies, and Chinese diaspora studies. I know the 9th FASIC conference has an equally extensive engagement of topics to discuss. I look forward to hearing the outcome from that. Over 80 speakers and panelists will be involved, and a wonderful opportunity to not just enjoy the presentations, but each other's company as we build this strong relationship between Australia and China. I'd like to finally acknowledge the invaluable work of the organising committee, led by Jing, of course, as Director of IAC here, and Shirley Gao, the Executive Director of Foundation for Australian Studies in China, and the FASIC team that supported Shirley. Thank you for joining us all in the opening, if I'm officially opening it ahead of Nick, the 10th Australia-China Transcultural Studies Symposium and the 9th FASIC conference at Western Sydney University. So glad I could do it, even though I'm not the Vice-Chancellor. Enjoy.
Professor Glover, thank you so much for your great speech, and such honor and privilege that we can have you. It means a lot to us and to the conferences, absolutely. Now, the president of our organizing partner, Beijing Foreign Studies University, Professor Jia Wenjian, unfortunately won't be able to come. He has been very supportive of the collaboration and recorded his message in their very professional studio. So now let's play the video.
Dear Professor Barney Glover, Commissioner of Jobs and Skills, Australia. Professor Colin McCarroll, Emeritus Professor of Griffith University and Honorary Professor of Beijing Foreign Studies University. Professor Nick Jones, Emeritus Professor of the University of Adelaide. Professor Jing Han, Director of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. Dr. Angela Lehman, Chair of the Foundation of Australian Studies in China. Dear friends, distinguished guests, on behalf of BFSU, I'm sending my greetings to you all at the joint reception of the 10th Australia-China Transcultural Studies Symposium and the 9th Foundation for Australian Studies in China Conference. My special thanks go to Professor Jing Han, Ms. Shirley Gao, and the organizing committee for organizing the conferences and the reception. I wish I could be with you in the beautiful city of Sydney. The first CAS Symposium was held at BFSU in November 2013 at the initiative of BFSU and Adelaide University. It aims to serve as a platform where Australian and Chinese researchers can collaborate to contribute expertise to global transcultural constructs and experiences. The past 9 symposiums held by BFSU with partner universities in Adelaide and Perth have strengthened close academic exchanges and collaboration between Chinese and Australian scholars, and have produced joint publications of journal articles, monographs, and textbooks. Last year, BFSU, in partnership with Western Sydney University, held the 9th CAS in Beijing. I'm very grateful that Professor Glover made a special trip to Beijing to open the symposium as the President and Vice Chancellor of Western Sydney University. He was joined by Pro-Vice Chancellor Professor Yichen Lan, Professor Jing Han, Professor Jocelyn Chen, the founding director and adjunct professor of IAC, and Dr. Julie Wen, Associate Dean of the School of Social Sciences. It was a sure sign of the close links between our 2 universities. CAS and ACTS has become an important platform for the research community in both China and Australia. I'm very happy that BFSU is represented by my distinguished colleagues, Associate Professor Li Youwen and Dr. Jiang Lu. I also take this opportunity to extend my warmest welcome to all the participants from China and Australia. This year's ACTS is held back-to-back with the 9th Foundation for Australian Studies in China conference, both in Sydney for the first time. The Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC, has provided strong support for the Australian Studies program at BFSU. The BFSU FASIC Colin McCarroll's Chair in Australian Studies program was launched in Beijing in June this year, and the first chair will be inaugurated in September 2025. Before I conclude my remarks, I'd like to extend a warm invitation to you all to the CAS 11 to be held in Beijing in 2025. I wish both ACTS 10 and FASIC 9 a great success. Thank you.
Li Laoshi, please pass on our great gratitude and thanks to President Professor Jia. It's wonderful to have his speech recorded. Tonight, we are also greatly honored by the representation of the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in Sydney. Please welcome the Consul for Education from the Consulate General, Ms. Lin Xiaoqing, to give a guest speech.
Professor Barney Glover AO, Commissioner of Job and Skills Australia, and Emeritus Vice Chancellor of Western Sydney University, Professor Nicholas Jones of University of Adelaide, distinguished guests, good evening. Many thanks to Professor Jing Han and Dr. Angela Lianmen for their kind invitation. It's really happy to attend the joint reception for the 10th Australia-China Transcultural Studies and Symposium and the 9th FASIC Conference of Australian Studies in China. On behalf of the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in Sydney, I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to both conferences and a warm welcome to the delegations from Chinese University. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, Western Sydney University, the Foundation of Australian Studies in China, and Beijing Foreign Studies University for their significant contributions to organize the conferences. Transcultural studies plays a crucial role in bridging cultural gaps, fostering mutual understanding, and enhancing our appreciation of each other's societal norms, values, and traditions. These conferences serve as a unique platform for scholars, researchers, and students from both China and Australia to engage in meaningful dialogue and explore the latest development in transcultural studies. By sharing insights, we advance academic understanding and contribute to mutually the deeper and more enduring friendship between the people. This year marks the 10th anniversary of state visit of President Xi Jinping to Australia and the establishment of the China-Australian Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Premier Li Qiang's successful visit to Australia has also opened up new opportunities. Looking ahead, I hope we can continue to work together to deepen our cultural understanding and strengthen our bilateral relationship. The Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in Sydney is fully committed to supporting and facilitating such invaluable research and exchanges. We recognize the vital role that academic collaboration plays in strengthening bilateral relations and enhancing mutual respect and cooperation. We will continue to facilitate people-to-people exchange between China and Australia. Once again, I wish both conferences great success and hope that everyone gains valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Consul Xiaoqing. It's a wonderful speech. Now, I first met Professor Nicholas Jones in 1986 at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, where I was a postgraduate student, and Nick was appointed a foreign expert at BFSU. For Chinese, if you're not Chinese, you're a foreigner. It doesn't matter if you're Australian, American, British, or Italian. The single word foreign covers all non-Chinese identities and nationalities. Educated in Australian National University and with a PhD from Oxford University, Dr. Nick Jones instantly gained our highest respect and regard as a foreign expert. Here, he is at the very center of the first international conference on Australian studies in China at Beijing Foreign Studies University in early 1988. You can see a smart dressed and serious-looking young scholar. The conference was organized by my supervisor, Professor Hu Wenzhong, who set up one of China's first Australian studies centers and who also introduced me to Australian studies in the first place. And there is me, an earnest student who years later has organized this 10th Australian-China Transcultural Studies Symposium in Sydney at Western Sydney University. I hope I have done my teachers and mentors proud. Now, if you have seen this photo of Dr. Nicholas Jones in Beijing in the 1980s, you will understand Nick is very multi-talented. He's not only an outstanding scholar, but also an accomplished diplomat, novelist, essayist, playwright, educator, and researcher. He taught English literature at ANU for 7 years and then taught at Beijing Foreign Studies University and China East Normal University before he served as the cultural counselor at Australian Embassy in Beijing from 1987 to 1990. During that period, Nick has made many friends with contemporary Chinese artists and introduced them to Australia, including the now internationally renowned artists like Guan Wei and ASEAN. And Nick famously smuggled out Guan Wei's series of paintings called Two-Finger Exercise, allegedly carried in his diplomatic pouch, now in the permanent collection of a Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney. Professor Nick Jones has written and published 15 books, including 7 novels, with the latest, The Idealist, published later last year, and 3 collections of short stories. His nonfiction includes Chinese Whispers and acclaimed memoir, Black Sheep. He's general editor of Macquarie Pen Anthology of Australian Literature and a co-editor of a recent book, Antipodean China, Reflections on Literary Exchange, a collection of writings by participating Australian and Chinese writers in the 5 China-Australia literary forums called CAF. Professor Jones was visiting chair of Australian Studies at Harvard University from 2009, and from 2012, he was professor of English and creative writing at the University of Adelaide. Now he is adjunct professor in the Writing and Society Research Centre at Western Sydney University and emeritus professor at the University of Adelaide. He is also our RAC Advisory Management Committee member. We couldn't be luckier and more honored to have Professor Nicholas Jones to give the keynote speech. Please welcome Professor Nicholas Jones.
Good evening, everyone. Let me start by thanking Nicholas Howie for his wonderful, generous welcome to us on his country. As I too acknowledge that we're meeting on the country of the Aromatigal people. I think that's a different group from Richmond, is that right? Anyway, of the Darug Nation, and acknowledge their ancestors who've been traditional owners of their country for tens of thousands of years. I acknowledge and pay my respect to elders past and present. Let me acknowledge Commissioner Glover. I'm not sure how I should refer to you now, but I would just like to say thank you for coming back. We miss you. I think you can go on using the commissionorial we as long as you like, as I am doing too when I say we welcome you back. And thank you to Beijing Foreign Studies University and representatives for being here. And also good to hear from Lin Xiaoqing from the Chinese consulate in Sydney. We had an important relationship through the cultural section of the consulate from the Western Sydney University perspective as we developed those CAFs, as we called them, China-Australia Literary Forum exchange through the Writing and Society group for many years. I'm very honoured to be asked to speak here. And more than that, I'm just so pleased that this event is happening. Not that I'm speaking at it, but that the event is happening. The 9th Foundation for Australian Studies in China Conference and 10th Australia-China Transcultural Studies Symposium. Those numbers, 9th and 10th, show that something that began 10 years or more ago is continuing. And that will be the theme of these remarks, really, continuing. Despite difficulties of many kinds, we, you, together, have managed to keep things going. This time it's being done differently. That's a good thing. The two separate strands are combining, and one of them is happening in Australia for the first time. And so let me commend the organisers and all of the participants for adapting to changing circumstances in this way and finding new ways to continue. And it's great to have many people here from FASIC, the 3 chairs, David Walker, Greg McCarthy, Professor Bu-Kong Kee, and the previous chair, Kevin Hopgood-Brown, the current chair, Angela Lehman, Shirley Gao, and also the large team from the Institute here at Western Sydney, led by Professor Jing Han, Lindsay Liu, and then my colleagues on the advisory committee too. I really am commending all of us for making this work. I was on the ground when these 2 initiatives got going 10 years ago. I remember speaking at the book launch of Australia's Asia, From Yellow Peril to Asian Century, edited by David Walker and Agnieszka Soboczinska at the University of Melbourne late in 2012, when we heard the news that David would be the inaugural BHP Billiton Chair of Australian Studies in China at Peking University, and the first FASIC conference was floating into view. Yes, so there's the book that was launched on that occasion in Melbourne on the left, and the other is the gate to Beijing Foreign Studies University, where a year later in 2013, I too was present at the inaugural CATS meeting after an agreement was signed with the University of Adelaide to run the joint symposia alternately in Beijing, Australia, called CATS or ACTS, depending on who was at the front at the time, but with a focus on transcultural studies, that title reflecting Beih's great strength in intercultural studies over many years, and the feeling among researchers in Australian studies in China that it was time to move a bit beyond that, the inside-outside binary of Australia and China, in favour of something more dynamic and more porous that fitted those times, globally more expansive and more mobile. It was clear that Australian studies in China attracted not only students of Australia in both countries, but also those in Australia engaged with China, whether as academics or in a professional capacity, and many others besides. So what I'm going to call the Australian Studies in China community, which is really the we that I'm speaking sort of for and out of here, that's what I mean. It encompassed journalists, translators, artists, writers, researchers, teachers, diplomats, business people, and more. Some of whom were part of a Chinese diaspora with connections to Australia, some of whom were Australianists from other countries, including from Japan and from the United States. So it was making sense to think more broadly and innovatively about the possibilities for Australian studies in China back then. Since then, things have changed in ways that have surprised and, well, disappointed many of us. More on that in a moment. When Professor Jing Han invited me to be one of the speakers for this symposium, she told me its theme would be past, present, future. Well, I liked that theme. And I said I assumed that I would be there to represent past. And actually, I felt that was okay. The direction of this talk is really the future, but I do want to get there from the past. So briefly, and you've just heard some of this, but my own introduction to Australian studies in China specifically came 40 years ago when I approached the Australia-China Council about the possibility of going to China to teach. I'd visited the People's Republic of China once already in 1983, and I'd seen the future. Well, at least my future, or a future for me. And with the help of Dr. Jocelyn Che at the ACC then, and Professor Hu Wen-jung, founder of the Australian Studies Centre at BFSU, and Professor Huang Yuan-shen, founder of the Australian Studies Centre at East China Normal University, Shanghai. I went to China in 1986, where I taught Australian literature and other things. In 1988, by then working at the Australian Embassy in Beijing, I helped Professor Hu and the newly formed Association for Australian Studies in China organise the first Australian Studies Conference in China at Beihai. And SNAP, I always like to show that slide too, because Jing Han is up there in the back row, and look at her now. But also just to show the very impressive array of delegates from both countries who were there, and many of whom are still around 40 years later. It got off to a good start. That wasn't the absolute beginnings of Australian studies in China either, and I'm delighted to acknowledge Colin McCarris here, who could fill us in on the even earlier stages of it, going back into the 1960s, I think. But also to mention the Oceanian Studies Centre at Anhui University, which had already been active in the field since 1979. And on the right is a copy of one of their early journals. And it's great to have Professor Zhang Chunjuan here from Anhui University representing that centre. Other Chinese organisations under various ministries had resources allocated to understanding Australia and the region better back then, and Australia reciprocated in its way. This was part of China's massive century-long commitment to acquiring knowledge of the outside world, commitment to education and research, which continues to this day. The interest in Australia was not an exception, it was the rule. China was interested in everything and everyone. Oceania extended to New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and other parts of the Pacific. So there was a context there for the Chinese interest in Australia that actually you didn't always find in Australian studies in Australia, that larger interest in the region. Fast forward to today, and we find this article in the Australian newspaper reporting that China has the largest Australian studies program outside Australia, with almost 40 study centres and about 250 Australianist scholars. According to the authors of a new book, How Australia is Studied in China, edited by Professor Richard Hu and Diane Hu, this development is regarded as, quote, a very successful example of cultural diplomacy. Well, that may be true, but it's as much due to the curiosity and determination of many Chinese people as to any Australian efforts. Australian studies in China has a life of its own, even as it must manage its existence as part of a larger system and within ever-changing policy, funding, and institutional support arrangements on both sides. When I look at the speakers and their topics over the next few days, I'm struck by the extraordinary range, variety, and innovation on display. Yet I also see continuity of participants. You know, I have many friends among you from recent years and past years, and apologies for not kind of naming everyone, but you know who you are. There's continuity of participation and personal relationships, and of thematic concerns where the present grows out of the achievements of the past. Australian studies in China has evolved in distinctive ways which are continuing and also being redefined by what's happening now. Australian studies in China not only has a life of its own, but an identity of its own. Can we say what that is? Looking back from 2024, I'm aware how relationships, whether institutional, intellectual, or personal, have been maintained from one generation to the next. We see continuity in the areas of interest, literature, for example. And we see change. For example, the attention given now to Aboriginal writing and generally research on and by and about First Nations people. And also a growing concern with the experience and representation of Chinese in Australia. When we look into the future, we can only guess. I quickly passed over the subtitle of my talk, which is Australian Studies in China, 1984 to 2064. I can look forward. I can look backwards 40 years. Can we look forward? 40 years? Well, we can try, even if we can only guess. What do we imagine for 2064? If we get that far, if we're lucky enough to escape catastrophe. In speaking of what I personally hope for, let me take a somewhat boring gradualist approach. Maybe that is at least predictable. But for 2064, I'll speak in generalities. I trust that China and Australia will both survive in some sort of recognisable form, although no doubt much changed. To get there, I hope for peace, achieved through the harmony and balance that can come with good management, and for the good relations that can come with dialogue and exchange. And that we'll all be well informed. That may sound utopian, but really it's not much more than a continuation of what we're trying to do now in the present. It's about maintenance. It's about keeping things going for the common good in an unpredictable and threatening world. I put my faith in that, in the continuance of gatherings such as this, talk fests, if you like, small steps maybe. So there can be a 20th conference of Australian Studies in China, and a 30th, and a 40th, and a 50th, when I hope that some of you at least are in charge. 2064 may seem a long way off, but as I learn looking back to 1984, I can say that it will come round soon enough, hopefully bearing the fruits of the work we're doing today. Chinese civilization has survived for thousands of years, even in the face of existential crisis. There are lessons to be learned there, including perhaps taking a long view of ups and downs. In Australia, Indigenous civilization has survived against the odds over many millennia into the 21st century. And there are lessons to be learned there too. Yet I would suggest that continuance has become something of a source of anxiety in contemporary Australia, where the future does not seem clear or certain. That is particularly so following the rejection of the Indigenous voice to Parliament in the referendum last year. It stopped a forward-looking process of recognition in its tracks. People were suddenly asking, where do we go from here? For many Australians, that failure relates to history, a refusal to recognise the truth of the past and how it persists into the society we are today. For some people, that failure is folded into the damage done to the environment too, within the larger dangers of climate emergency, precarity, and extinction. These are concerns of Alexis Wright's novel, Praiseworthy, published last year, for example, as hopes and fears for her people's future play out, and in which China appears as a refuge for one of the characters in her dreams. Continuance is necessary but difficult, and that's why I have called this talk Famous Last Words, because whatever I say, it's likely to go another way. It has been a turbulent few years for China-Australia relations. In Australia, an anti-China rhetoric spread through sectors of government and the media to universities, arts organisations, and opinion and decision makers of all kinds. China was once again outside Australia's comfort zone. Some of us were shocked that it could happen so quickly and so completely. There had been some resistance, I was aware of that. There was fatigue, there was pushback, there was what I would call stupidity in some cases. I felt it at an event at Sydney University to mark the 45th anniversary of diplomatic relations in 2017, when Malcolm Turnbull, as Prime Minister, was quoted as saying to Linda Jacobson, director of the now defunct China Matters think tank, "Oh, Linda, China's just too hard." Before we knew it, China was not only in the too hard basket, it was in the deep freeze. An upside, though, has been the belated recognition that Australia has its own China at home here in the form of the broad and deep network of people-to-people relations, including many Australians with Chinese background and extending out through the Chinese world and the wider world. China was not only not going away, it was here in ways that we needed to understand better. So we've been thinking again in terms of who and where we already are and how to make the best of that. That's the message I hear from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, with its strategic pillars of, quote, improving China capability and, quote, engaging and enabling our diverse communities. That builds on the welcome report last year for the Australian Academy of the Humanities on Australia's China knowledge capability. Gives persuasive data to show that this China knowledge capability has declined concerningly in recent years. It defines that capability as being able to generate knowledge about China that meets our distinctive needs and to train enough graduates in foundational, specialised and core China knowledge so that Australians are adequately informed as citizens and at work. The report is done in a context of university work, but it extends out beyond that. And note in what I just said, that wide reference, so that Australians are adequately informed as citizens and at work. All Australians, that means. In her foreword to the report, Frances Adamson, former DFAT Secretary and Australia's Ambassador to PRC, puts it in a nutshell. China knowledge allows us to orient our relationship effectively towards positive outcomes. Reciprocally, too, knowledge of Australia helps China orient relationships towards positive outcomes, large and small. Such knowledge helps us understand where the other is coming from and how we see each other, how we regard each other. It's an obvious and fundamental thing, and yet often goes missing. Your work here helps with all of that. The local context can be writ large, can be written globally, but the work happening locally here is important. The authors of the Academy report conclude that the whole adds up to so much less than the parts. So they're talking about this China knowledge capability and saying in Australia at the moment, the whole is less than the sum of the parts. It's a very interesting observation, I think. How I interpret that is that the Chinese studies programs can't fix the problems by themselves. It's the larger environment that is the problem, where all these different aspects of China in Australia somehow have not been integrated or incorporated into a national narrative, a common purpose. I don't know how that problem can be fixed, but the report, working in the university framework, says the capability build will succeed or fail depending on the actions taken in universities. So against that sobering background, the present gathering is a bright hope. And Western Sydney University's Institute for Arts and Culture continues to be a shining light. The lens of arts and culture lets us see a variety of Chinese and Australian perspectives and creates the inclusive spaces we need, making Australians with Chinese background more fully part of the whole. I want now just to quote something from History of the Chinese in Australia, written by historian Eric Rolls some time ago, a sprawling 2-volume book that sadly no one reads. But there is a little passage in it which I really, really cherish. So I've put it up here. Without the Chinese, Australia would be a lesser country. So that's really the bottom line. And then he spells it out. For one thing, it is unlikely we would now hold the Northern Territory. Until Chinese diggers made gold mining pay, there were suggestions that this wondrous stretch of country should be sold to relieve the insupportable costs of upkeep. Chinese vegetable growers saved the goldfields from a disaster of scurvy, and later, by producing 3/4 of the vegetables eaten in Australia for the last 30 years of the 19th century, they probably saved the whole country. For years, Chinese cooks and gardeners improved life on stations all over Australia, including in the remotest areas. Chinese fishermen introduced first fresh fish to towns and cities, both on the coast and inland. In Queensland, Chinese farmers grew the first maize, rice, peanuts, pineapples, and bananas, and demonstrated what could be done with these crops. They received no thanks while they were doing it, and they have received no recognition since. Well, it's a remarkable bit of writing. It places the Chinese at the heart of agriculture, pastoralism, and mining, the industries that made Australia, making Chinese background Australians integral to the society's survival and success. And I wish that is the kind of story that could be incorporated more into our national narrative. Australian studies in China enhances our understanding of this. Australian studies through a Chinese lens does that. And it brings into frame the connection with Chinese histories and communities elsewhere outside Australia, and also with present day communities here. Some of this work will be familiar to you, the work of the Chinese Australian Historical Society, the Museum of Chinese Australian History in Melbourne, Sydney's new Museum of Chinese in Australia. It's having its impact. And it's, I think, reconnecting the past and the present in important ways. One generation's present quickly becomes the next generation's past. And over time, the line between Chinese migrant and Australian citizen disappears. Through interaction and relationship, one becomes the other, each in their own way. The hope is that the population as a whole appreciates the benefits that brings, which are many. China is there, here, in Australia's past, present, and future. As a great expression and achievement of humankind, Chinese civilization is for all of us, including in Australia. I speak as one whose life has been immeasurably enriched by Chinese thought, practice, knowledge, arts, the arts of living that come with Chinese culture. And that's a world of learning, of inheritance, a set of relationships that I hope will be available to all Australians as we go forward. It needs valuing, it needs care and support. So to conclude, my message is really this message of continuity, but continuity doesn't mean repetition and sameness. It's rather about finding that pathway to something new that comes from understanding what has gone before and continues its larger purpose. Continuity, continuation, continuance. Continuance. It's a less common word. It suggests something that is a process, active, abstract maybe. And I'm taking it here from a poem by the Australian poet Rosemary Dobson that she published in 1984 for a poet friend when they were reading translations of classic Chinese poetry together, especially the work of Li Bai. Around that time, 1984, Dobson had visited China. In her mind, the landscape of Tang poetry merged with the landscape around Canberra. And she wrote these lines from a poem called Translations Under the Trees. Pollen brushed from the table flies off to make forests in faraway countries, may change a landscape. Poems blow away like pollen, find distant destinations, can seed new songs in another language. And she calls that the continuance of poetry. I'll stop there and ask you just to think forward to 2064 and just see what you see. Maybe we can talk about it later. And for now, I'll just end with a couple of happy slides showing some friends. Happy Together, David Walker and Li Yao and Karen Walker, your book, and Alexis Wright with the Chinese-Tibetan writer Alai, and Li Yao, the translator of her novel Carpentaria in Guangzhou in 2017 at one of the China-Australia Literary Forum events. Thank you. I declare the event open and wish you every success with it. And I only wish I could hear your thoughts on 2064, but maybe someone will one day. Thank you.
It's such a joy listening to Professor Nicholas Jones. His speech is so thoughtful and so eloquent, so beautifully written. It's just amazing. Thank you so much. It's just so wonderful we have you. The Foundation of Australian Studies in China has been our long-standing partner and collaborator, starting with Kevin Hopgood-Brown, who had been the chair of a foundation for 11 years, if I remember correctly. And we have continued our very successful collaborations and partnership with the current chair, Dr. Angela Lerman. Among many collaborations that we have, the co-organizing these two conferences is our latest joint venture. So I would like to invite Dr. Angela Lerman, Chair of FASIC, to give the closing remarks.
Thank you. And wow, it's a hard job to follow our amazing speakers that we've already had today. And there's so much that Nicholas's speech has left me with to think about, not least of which is where I will be in 2064, which is a rather depressing thought, but we'll put some thought into it. Just by way of introduction, my name, thank you, Jing, is Angela Lerman. I've been the chair of FASIC for just over a year now. It feels like yesterday. I'm following from the incredible Mr. Kevin Hopgood-Brown, who, as Jing said, led the organisation for 11 years. In that 1 year that I've been in this role, I've just been so astounded by a few things, by the incredible community that exists in China within Australian studies. I've been fortunate enough to go to China twice since being in this role, and meeting the scholars, the young scholars in particular, who are so energetic and so thoughtful and so engaged with Australia and so hungry for engagement with Australian scholars and to learn about Australia. I've also been very surprised by the growth of this community, growth in terms of numbers, but growth in terms of that breadth of disciplines that is now being engaged with across China. I'm not going to talk for long today because we are sponsored today by the lovely Penfolds Wine Company, and I think we can all try to sample some of that on the way out. But I would like to say a few things. I hadn't planned to talk about this, but as I was listening to our speakers today, I had a thought in my head. During the year I've been chair of FASIC, I've told many of my friends, family, colleagues about FASIC. None of them know it exists. They're all surprised. What is it? What is the Foundation for Australian Studies in China? They say, are you sure you don't mean the Foundation for China Studies in Australia? No, I've got it round the right way, trust me. Who is studying Australia in China? There's this sense of confusion. Why would anyone want to study Australia? Why? And I think it's really fascinating for me to hear the responses from Australians to this phenomenon that we are here today and over the weekend to celebrate. To me, it points to something in Australia's identity, and it points to something about our confidence as a nation, that we are worthy indeed of being studied. It also points to something about connection. It points to this question of how Australia sees itself as connected to China, as connected so very deeply to China that, of course, people in China are keen to study a land that they have had a deep and ongoing history with. So I will keep record, I think, of people's reactions to FASIC when I talk to them. And today, one of the reasons I'm so excited about this event is, of course, the incredible people in this room today. But this is the first time FASIC has held this conference in Australia. It's, of course, as the heading it tells us, it's the 9th conference, but this is our first conference in Australia. And going to those points I just mentioned, maybe about the awareness in Australia about this incredible community of scholarship in China, I'm hoping that this conference being held here provides an opportunity for us to showcase the success story that really is Australian studies in China. As someone mentioned already today, it is the largest network of Australianists in the world, and FASIC is a part of that story. We help, we support, and we engage with this growing community of people in China who are doing incredible work and facilitate, we hope, collaboration between our two countries. I wanted just to very quickly mention a few people in this room who are very important to FASIC and to the success story that we're talking about today. I wanted to mention our 3 BHP Billiton chairs of Australian Studies in China. This is an incredible program that started 2012 and was a collaboration of the Australia-China Council, FASIC, and I might forget someone, Peking University, of course, and BHP Billiton, of course. And we have all 3 of these chairs in the room today. As far as I know, this is the first event our 3 chairs have been at today so far. So we have Professor David Walker, Professor Greg McCarthy, and Professor Pukong Ki here today, and we're very excited to have them with us. I'd like to thank you all for coming along. I think these ongoing connections and relationships, as was said by Professor Jose earlier, enable our countries to weather difficult times. We've had some tough times, and we're emerging now into this period of time that our politicians like to call a stabilising period. What I've noticed that as we're coming out of this political and business stabilising period, the Australian studies community is growing. It's not stopped. It's continued to grow. It's been very resilient. It's a resilient community. It's a strong community. And despite the tensions, we are now emerging from our bilateral tensions with this strong community that we see here today. This can't be taken for granted. It's due to a lot of long-standing efforts by many people in both Australia and China that we're in this position today, that we have this resilience. And today I just want to mention a very few of these people. They've been mentioned many times already, but I would like to acknowledge them as well. Professor Barney Glover, of course, we're so grateful to you for your ongoing support, despite you leaving your wonderful institution. And we're very grateful for you to continue to support the work that's being done and for your opening words today. Professor Nicholas Jose, you're an outstanding example of a career that is engaged with literature, culture, arts, and a deep China knowledge to inform and entertain Australians and others around the world. I'd like to acknowledge Beijing Foreign Studies University and Professor Li Yuwen for continued partnership and contribution to Australian studies in China. Professor Colin McCarris, of course, for your deep and long-standing contribution. And FASIC is proud to be working with BFSU for the Colin McCarris Chair of Australian Studies in China. I'd like to acknowledge Consul Lin Xiaoting and thank her for being with us to help celebrate today. And Dr. Nicoline Murdoch, the incoming PVC Global Partnerships at WSU. Western Sydney University are a proud supporter of the work that's being done in this community to build and maintain academic connections between Australia and China. FASIC Executive Director Shirley Gao is a walking superstar. She has done so much, and there's been a team of volunteers working together to put this on today. I'd also like to thank, as there's been lots of thanks going on, but the scholars that are here today, the scholars that have travelled from China, from Perth, from all around Australia to come here today to talk. This is where those connections happening. This is in the doing of it, in the action of academic collaboration is where we forge those strong and resilient ties. Before I finish, there is one very important thank you. The incredible Professor Jing Han and her team at IAC for the remarkable efforts over many months to pull together such a significant event in the Australia-China calendar. I'm wishing ACTS 10 and FASIC 9 wonderful success. Before I sign off, I'd like to acknowledge two sponsors we have. We have Penfolds Wine, very grateful for the wine. Please do sample it. We have a representative from Penfolds here today, Michael, who's happy to have a few words and introduce some of the wines that we have here today, and ERM, who are a sustainability management company who are here to support the Australia-China relationship. Enjoy the events and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
I must thank a few people. Firstly, my co-organizer, Shirley Gao, which I mentioned a few times, for being the best collaborator. For months, 6 months in the making, we've had so many conversations late at night, over the weekends, early in the mornings. Shirley, you are the best. I also want to thank Li Jianjun of a Beijing Foreign Studies University and a Western Sydney University PhD candidate. Anthony is he's a supervisor, who has done a lot of groundwork in China for the conference. And thank BFSU for the long-standing partnership. We wouldn't be able to do all this without my university's invaluable support, especially my director leader, Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Deborah Sweeney, as well as our newly installed Vice Chancellor, Distinguished Professor George Williams. Special thanks to our participants, particularly those who came all the way from China. And thanks again to all our speakers. Last but not the least, I must thank my IAC 4 Women team, Sally Bowman, Lindsay Liu, and Yanni Liu, for being the best team and for loving the work we do. And our volunteers, Li Pan, Gao Wa, Xiao Wu, and Song Tao, Iris, and also Xiong Yan. So many of them are our PhD students. Thank you all for coming. Have a great evening.